We start with this session now, and the chairpersons for this sessions are already available. Dr. Agarwal, Dr. Jyoti, Dr. Malhotra is not available. This session will comprise of talks from Dr. Anand, Dr. Arun, Dr. Purisar, and Dr. Animesh. So, actually. So now I will request the chairperson, Dr. Agarwal and Dr. Jyoti, to take over this session. And again, once again, very warm good morning to all of you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
No, now I can only see your folder.
Thank you, Dr. Srivastav. This is the first session of the third day, last day, and how I approach it. So, first speaker is Dr. K.S. Anand. He will present a digi patient, how one approaches. Dr. Anand, is Dr. Anand join us? Dr. Anand?
सर उनका रिकॉर्डेड टॉक है सर.
अच्छा, recorded. Okay. Let's start now. We can start.
Good morning. Today we'll be talking about approach to a dizzy patient. So what is dizziness? Dizziness, it is a non-specific term. It is an umbrella term most commonly used by patients to describe their own feelings. It is mainly the subjective feeling of the patient, and it has many other terms under it, which are, it could be vertigo, disequilibrium, presyncope, or a non-specific lightheadedness. So, for example, vertigo, it could be a subjective sense of imbalance or a hallucination of movement or an illusion of movement. It may be subjective or objective, we'll come to it in the next slides. It could be a disequilibrium, which we know that there is impairment of balance or gait or a wobbly sense of unsteadiness. It could be presyncope, sensation of impending faint or loss of consciousness. It could be non-specific lightheadedness, which is a vague symptom, or it may be a feeling of giddiness or wooziness, feeling of disconnection. So, in simpler terms, we can ask the patient, does the room spin around? If yes, then it could be vertigo. Or if the patient feels unsteady, it points towards disequilibrium. Do you feel like you may faint? It points towards presyncope. Or do you feel just dizzy, which is non-specific dizziness? If neither of the above, then it could be psychiatric. Coming to vertigo, it is a sensation of motion when no motion is occurring relative to Earth's gravity. Or it is an illusion of motion. It is a feeling of movement, a sensation as if the external world were revolving around the patient, which is objective vertigo, or as if he himself were revolving in space, which is subjective vertigo. So this spinning sensation mainly points towards vertigo. So the neuroanatomy of vertigo, we know that there are 3 canals and 2 otoliths in each ear, the semicircular canals, saccule and the utricle. Now vestibular nerve, it carries signal to the vestibular nuclei. Otoliths, they are responsible for sensing linear acceleration, and semicircular canals, they sense head rotation. Now, the neural connections that are contributing to vertigo are vestibulospinal, vestibulo-ocular and vestibulo-autonomic limbic. So, if any of these systems are disturbed, it would lead to vertigo, and it has different components, contributes to different components of vertigo. Like vestibulospinal tract disturbance, it will cause sensation that the body is being hurled or pulled in space, leading to unsteadiness. Vestibulo-ocular system connection, it will cause nystagmus, and vestibulo-autonomic limbic, it will cause vegetative symptoms like nausea and vomiting. Now, assessment of vertigo on the basis of associated symptoms. So now if it is associated with ear symptoms like hearing loss, ear discharge, tinnitus, neurological symptoms like headache, visual disturbance, dysarthria, dysphagia, paresthesias, or autonomic symptoms like nausea, vomiting, sweating or palpitations, or symptoms suggesting migraine, aura. Those are visual or olfactory symptoms. Likewise, if it is associated with oral fullness, it points towards acoustic neuroma or Meniere's, ear or mastoid pain, facial weakness, acoustic neuroma or herpes zoster, focal neurological findings like cerebellopontine angle tumor, cerebrovascular disease, MS, a headache like migraine, hearing loss like in Meniere's perilymphatic fistula, acoustic neuroma, imbalance like acute vestibular neuronitis, cerebellopontine angle tumor, nystagmus, peripheral or central vertigo, phonophobia and photophobia pointing towards migrainous vertigo, and tinnitus pointing towards labyrinthitis, acoustic neuroma or Meniere's disease. On the basis of medical history, again we can differentiate. If we can ask the patient, do you become dizzy just rolling over in the bed? It points towards postural or positional vertigo, which is the benign paroxysmal positional vertigo. Or we can ask the patient if he is sensitive to light during the dizzy spell, pointing towards the photophobia or the migrainous symptoms. So it points toward vestibular migraine. We can ask the patient if he feels any ear full or before or during an attack, oral fullness pointing towards Meniere's, or does a loud sound make you dizzy or make your world jiggle? The superior semicircular canal dehiscence. We can also ask if your first attack of severe vertigo, did it last hours with nausea and vomiting? It could be vestibular neuritis. We need to rule out TIA, stroke, CP angle tumor. We can ask, are you lightheaded when you get up from a bed or chair for a few seconds? So it could point towards postural hypotension or a cardiovascular disease. Assessment on the basis of duration, this is very important. As you know that the BPPV, they last for less than 1 minute, vestibular paroxysmia lasts for less than 1 minute, superior canal dehiscence syndrome also lasts for seconds to minutes. But vestibular migraine on the other hand, Meniere's disease, they last for minutes to hours. So hence we can differentiate such things on the basis of timing. Also, the vertigo, it could be acute in onset lasting days to weeks, like in acute unilateral vestibulopathy or a brainstem or cerebellar infarction, or it could have persisting symptoms which last for months to years, like bilateral vestibulopathy, functional dizziness, neurodegenerative disorders like cerebellar or extrapyramidal disorders. Also, to simplify, if we can also divide the vertigo on the basis of hearing normal and hearing impaired. So, if in a normal hearing the vertigo lasts for seconds, a few seconds, points towards BPPV, minutes it points towards posterior circulation TIA, hours it points towards vestibular migraine, days vestibular neuronitis or CVA, and weeks it points towards PPP, Lyme's or MS. Likewise, if hearing is impaired lasting for a few seconds, it points towards perilymph fistula, minutes cholesteatoma, hours Meniere's, days labyrinthitis or CVA, and weeks, if with hearing impaired, it points towards acoustic neuroma or autoimmune process. Now, how to diagnose vertigo? Basic approach to a patient. The patient may present with dizziness. We need to differentiate it from pre-syncope, disequilibrium or non-specific dizziness with the spinning sensation. Then we need to rule out history of any medication, caffeine, nicotine or alcohol intake, or history of head trauma or whiplash injury. We need to ascertain that it is a false sense of motion of spinning sensation. Then we know that it is pointing towards vertigo. Now, of the causes of vertigo, if the vertigo is associated with any headache or other symptom suggestive of migraine, it points towards migraine. If it is associated with hearing loss, we will come to in the next slide. If it is associated with any neurological deficit, we know the CNS causes like infarction or demyelinating lesions, which we will have to undergo a neuroimaging. Then other causes with neurological deficit can be obvious with the history like traumatic or cervicogenic. Then those cases of vertigo which are presenting with hearing loss, as we saw, if it is presenting with hearing loss, then no fever, Meniere's, fever, labyrinthitis. These are just pointers towards the specific causes of vertigo. Then if there is no hearing loss leading to vestibular neuritis, it causes cause can be viral infection or a BPPV, it could be postural. We need to perform Dix-Hallpike maneuver. Now differentiating between central and peripheral vertigo. Central vertigo, it involves structures in the central nervous system, cerebrum, cerebellum or brainstem, and peripheral vertigo, it involves structures that are not part of the central nervous system, most frequently the inner ear. The distinguishing features, we know, we will go through them again. The direction of the associated nystagmus in peripheral vertigo, it is unidirectional and fast phase is opposite the lesion, whereas in central vertigo it is bidirectional or unidirectional. Purely horizontal nystagmus is without torsional component is common in central vertigo. Then a vertical or purely torsional nystagmus, it may be present in central vertigo, but it is never present in peripheral vertigo. Visual fixation, it inhibits nystagmus and vertigo in peripheral cases, but there is no inhibition in central vertigo. And the severity of vertigo is marked in peripheral vertigo as compared to central vertigo. Duration of symptoms in peripheral vertigo is finite and it may be recurrent. Usually the central vertigo is chronic, it may be chronic. Then tinnitus and deafness is often present in peripheral vertigo and it is often absent in central vertigo. Then associated CNS abnormalities are extremely common in central vertigo like diplopia, hiccups, cranial neuropathies, dysarthria. Common causes of peripheral vertigo are BPPV, infection, labyrinthitis, Meniere's, neuronitis, ischemia, trauma or toxins, whereas in central vertigo these are vascular, demyelinating or neoplasm. So, key examination while examining a patient of vertigo, it includes the general examination which has the blood pressure. We need to check for postural drop. Cardiac auscultation needs to be done for cardiac causes as we saw, and the neck range of movements to rule out any cervical spondylosis or to look for the causes of vertigo due to cervical spondylosis. Then we need to examine the ear for any infection or discharge or any cholesteatoma. We need to examine the eye, nystagmus, which is common in acute vertigo, and we must do the fundoscopy as well. Then neurological examination needs to be done, wherein we also the gait and ability to stand unaided, cranial nerves, cerebellar functions, signs of peripheral neuropathy or any indication of a cerebrovascular event. Then an important test pertaining to vertigo is the HINTS test or the HIT, evaluation of nystagmus and test of skew. So, in HINTS exam we have the head impulse test, nystagmus and skew test. On the basis of this exam we can differentiate between a peripheral vertigo as well as the central vertigo. On head impulse, loss of eye fixation with head impulse, positive or abnormal, is a sign of peripheral vertigo, but intact vestibulo-ocular reflex, it points towards the central vertigo. Then there is no nystagmus or horizontal unidirectional nystagmus, which we have discussed in the previous slide, pointing to peripheral vertigo, but vertical, rotatory or horizontal bidirectional nystagmus points to central vertigo. Then tests of skew, there is no skew deviation in peripheral vertigo, it is negative, and skew deviation is positive in central vertigo. What is skew deviation? It is vertical ocular misalignment that results from a right-left imbalance of vestibular neural firing. Skew deviation is generally detected by alternate cover testing, and skew deviation in acute vestibular syndrome was strongly linked to the presence of brainstem lesions, pointing towards central vertigo. Other causes of central vertigo, these are vertebrobasilar insufficiency, brainstem stroke, cerebellar stroke, demyelinating diseases, tumors, trauma, head and neck injury and cervical vertigo. 25% of patients of the vertigo have central cause and incidence is higher in elderly. Ataxia is the most useful sign for diagnosing cerebellar pathology. An etiologic targeted management is acceptable. An acute phase of central vertigo, use of antihistaminics, antiemetics, benzodiazepines and vestibular sedatives is recommended. Hospital admission for patients suspected of central vertigo is advised. So, the take home message, ensure you understand what the patient means by dizzy. We need to differentiate it from the causes of dizziness, which are vertigo or disequilibrium or a presyncope or a non-specific symptom, which could be psychiatric cause of a dizziness. Then once we try to differentiate central vertigo from peripheral vertigo. Often there is significant overlap, but good clinical examination is very helpful, and we need to see if it was spontaneous or provoked. Then type of nystagmus needs to be seen. We can perform the HINDS test, which includes head impulse test, nystagmus and test of skew deviation. Also, we can always bank on other neurological signs to differentiate between the causes of dizziness. Thank you.
Being a recorded presentation, so there's to be no questions, but only comments by anyone from the floor or Dr. Jyoti. That's all. So we can go to the second presentation, a case of diplopia by Dr. Arun Kaul. Dr. Arun Kaul is an associate professor in neurology at G.V. Pant Institute of Postgraduate Medical Education Research, New Delhi. Now I request Dr. Arun Kaul to present the deliberation.
Greetings to the chairpersons. So I'll be talking about that how do I approach a case of diplopia.
You can, sorry to interrupt, sir, but you can do the presentation in full mode. Yeah.
So why is diplopia important and the bedside clinical examination is important? So this was a case series of around 150 patients over a 2-year period where they showed that just by listening to the history of the patient and the initial evaluation on outpatient basis, you are able to diagnose more than 80% of the cases of diplopia. So that is how important a clinical examination is. But the patients of diplopia, they never come, I mean, most of the time they will not come with frank diplopia. Sometimes they will come with visual blurring. They may suggest that they have a deficient hand-eye coordination and sometimes a difficulty in negotiating stares. So you should be very careful once you are assessing the symptoms of diplopia. So the first thing which comes to your mind is that whether the patient has a monocular diplopia or a binocular diplopia. So why is this important? Because monocular diplopia is mostly because of the eye problems. But another thing to be kept in mind is that it can be bilateral. So, because most often what we do in patients who have when we have to differentiate between a uniocular from a binocular diplopia, we ask the patient to close the eye. So if the monocular diplopia is coming from the same eye, so you miss it, the monocular as a binocular. So it is very important that you cover one eye first, see if the diplopia is gone, and then cover the other eye also. So as I told you that this is mostly related to the eye problems, then sometimes disorders of the retina. But what is important to us is that we should not miss a case of what is called a cerebral polyopia that can cause a monocular diplopia. So this is a case report where a patient had a parieto-occipital infarct, and whereby he used to see more than about 100 to 200 pictures of the same image. So you can just guess that how a cerebral polyopia can disturb your vision. So in cerebral diplopia or polyopia, as against what we see in the binocular diplopia, which is because of the other causes, all the images are clear. And uniocular binocular is not going to make a difference. It does not resolve with the pinhole. Any diplopia which occurs because of refractory error is going to resolve with the pinhole. And it is one form of diplopia. The cerebral diplopia is a palinopsia, where the patient sees a particular image, and when he takes his focus away from that particular image, the image continues to be present in the patient's visual field. So once we are done with the monocular diplopia, we come to the binocular diplopia, which is more commonly seen in the neurology practice. So why do we have a diplopia? Why does it occur? Because we know that once we are focusing on a particular object, the image falls on the corresponding parts of the retina. So whenever there is a misalignment of the eyes, the image on one, the image is going to fall on the non-corresponding parts of the retina, and because of this, we see diplopia. So it can occur because of the involvement of the extraocular muscle, whether the muscle is weak or it is overacting, or sometimes, as the previous speaker had said, that it can be because of a skew deviation, which is a central cause. So before you go for an examination of diplopia, you should be well versed with that what are the primary, secondary, tertiary actions of the muscles. Here you should see that just the medial and the lateral rectus, the medial rectus is involved in adduction and the lateral rectus in abduction. And the other things is important to know that the superior oblique intorts, that the obliques are intorters. Sorry, the superior oblique intorts as well as the superior rectus is intorter. So you should be aware of what is the primary, secondary, and tertiary action before you ascribe the diplopia to a particular extraocular muscle. So what are the points in the history you should take? First and foremost is whether the diplopia is horizontal and vertical. So if the diplopia is horizontal, suppose if we are seeing to the right, the patient is seeing to the right and is having diplopia, so the involved muscle may be either the lateral rectus of the right eye or the medial rectus of the left eye. So how do we differentiate between the two? We just ask the patient to focus on a nearby object, and we eliminate the object of the lateral, the action of the lateral rectus, and the patient will have diplopia on the near vision. And you should always ask whether the patient is seeing tilting of the images, especially in case of the vertebral diplopia. Whenever there is a tilting of images, it is mostly because of an oblique involved muscle. The oblique muscle is involved rather than a vertical acting rectus or rather than the vertical acting muscle, other muscles. So in the eye movement testing, you see first whether you should always before you begin eye examination, you should make it a point that you stabilize the head of the patient, that the position of the head is correct. And after that, you see the eyes are aligned or not. So one of the easy tests is to focus a torchlight into the patient's eyes and see whether the light reflex is falling on the corresponding parts of the pupil or not. In this way, you will be able to see whether the patient has a manifest squint or not. Fixation, as the previous talk was saying, that you should always ask the patient to fix the eye on a nearby object, and subtle movements, sometimes the square wave jerks or other primary position nystagmus can be seen. And it is always important to check ductions, which are the unilateral movements, as well as the versions. Then we test for saccades and smooth pursuit. All these things should be done because some things are visible in only some cases. Like in some cases, saccade may be impaired, a pursuit may be impaired. So if you do all these things, you are not going to miss anything. So once we are done with the monocular and binocular, then we see whether the diplopia is constant or intermittent. As we all know that we are well aware that whenever the intermittent diplopia, we think of myasthenia gravis. But besides myasthenia gravis, there are other causes also which can cause a transient diplopia, important of which is the decompression of a pre-existing phoria. That is, sometimes the people may have continuous phoria. Phoria is a latent squint. And then myasthenia, of course, and thyroid ophthalmopathy and other causes of transient diplopia. So transient diplopia does not always mean myasthenia gravis. So this is a case, this was a 50-year-old female who had this congenital esotropia, and she never had diplopia. But once she, as you can see in the right eye, she has developed an opacity, so she has a cataract, and now the strabismus has become decompensated, and she came with diplopia. This is a So you should never, you should always exclude myasthenia in case of whatever diplopia it is, whatever the eye signs are, you should always exclude myasthenia. So here we are just trying to see, you are lifting one eye, the other eye is getting droop. And in the second part of the video, I am asking her to close her eyes tightly. So if the patient has a diplopia, he has difficulty in opening the eyes as well as closing the eyes. So the diagnoses are only two, either it is a muscle disease or a neuromuscular junction. Muscle disease usually does not cause diplopia, so it will be a neuromuscular junction. So myasthenia is to be included in all cases of diplopia. Whether it starts with pain, without pain, any diplopia, you should always exclude the myasthenia gravis. Next, we come to the thyroid ophthalmopathy, which is a very common cause and often missed cause of, because these are not, the eye signs are not always so manifest. The thing about the thyroid eye disease is that it causes a restrictive ophthalmopathy, and there's a mnemonic to how to remember the muscles involved in thyroid ophthalmopathy, and it is I am slow. So I is for inferior rectus, M is for medial rectus, and S is for superior rectus. So as you can see in the image, the medial rectus is so bulky. So what happens in thyroid, as I told you, that it is a restrictive ophthalmopathy. So suppose if my medial rectus is involved, so since it is a restrictive ophthalmopathy, it will cause an esotropia. So it is important to know, because whenever we have a medial rectus, say because of third nerve involvement, so eye will get deviated outwards. But if it is because of the involvement of a thyroid, that is a restrictive ophthalmopathy, the eye will be deviated inwards. Another thing, once you do the images, you see that whether the tendon is involved or just the muscle is involved. If the tendon is spared, so the initial part where the muscle attaches to the eyeball will be spared, and it will have what is called as the fusiform involvement. And if it is the tendon is also involved. That is a cylindrical configuration, more commonly seen in orbitopseudotromal rather than the thyroid ophthalmopathy. Then we come to the constant diplopia, most commonly seen by the involvement of the third nerve. So in nuclear lesions, as we can, the neurology is all about localization. So whenever you have a nuclear lesion, so if the third nerve, the central caudal nucleus is involved, that is the LPS nucleus, you will have a bilateral ptosis. And since the contralateral superior rectus has the innervation of the superior rectus is contralateral, so bilateral superior rectus is involved. And one thing to remember in nuclear regions is that if the nuclear region, if the medial rectus is involved in isolation, it is usually not a central lesion. I mean a nuclear lesion, because okay, we'll discuss the reasons later. So this is how, I mean, you test the third nerve. You just look at the right eye and just focus on the 12 o'clock position. You see when the intorsion is preserved, you just have to look at the scleral vessels and see how they are intorted. The pupil is dilated, and once we are asking the patient to look down, intorsion is occurring. And it cannot, this case cannot be overemphasized. In a case of painful ophthalmoplegia where the pupil is dilated, the extraocular muscles are all involved, you have always to rule out the aneurysmal third nerve palsy. And if even the MRI is normal, MR angio is normal, you should always go for a DSA. You should never miss a case of aneurysmal third nerve palsy. In diabetic is a very common cause of ischemic third nerve palsy where the pupil will be spared. But whenever you see any associated signs, see the lid is swollen in this patient. So an ischemic third nerve palsy will not cause the swelling of the lid. So whenever you see a swelling of the lid, you should be very cautious and exclude the other causes. Here she had a very severe fungal infection in the cavernous sinus. So diabetes causes isolated nerve palsy. So suppose if the patient has a third and a fourth, so it is unlikely to be because of diabetes. Pupil is mostly spared, but sometimes it can be involved, as in the diabetes causes autonomic neuropathy as well. So it should, once you follow up the patient, it should resolve completely over a period of 3 to 4 months. So this is analysis of 1400 patients of just third nerve palsy. I just want to impress upon that only 2% of the cases which were because of aneurysm spared the pupil. So the pupil involvement is important. So the fourth nerve, the other cause of a diplopia is fourth nerve. Listen to the history of the patient. So this is very typical of a fourth nerve palsy, the superior oblique, who have difficulty negotiating stairs because we know that the superior oblique intorts and depresses. So the patient will have a difficulty in going downstairs. And you see also the head is tilted towards the opposite side, and it is one of the diplopia rules that the head will always be tilted or turned in the direction of the action of the weak muscle. This is from another patient of a superior oblique palsy. In fact, I became aware of this test only after the patient drew this for me. She was a drawing teacher and she said that I see the color pencils like this. So I see tilted when I asked her to draw. So this is the color pencil she drew. And I came to know that just by asking the patient to draw the image, if the two images are intersecting towards the left, it is because of the left fourth nerve palsy. And if the images are intersecting towards the right, it is a right fourth nerve palsy. So you can do it at that side. This is another test which is made popular, that to see whether the difference between the two images, that is the diplopia, how it varies from the upright to the supine position. If it varies by more than 50%, so it is mostly because of a central cause, that is a skew deviation. If it does not, it is because of the fourth nerve palsy. So it is, I mean, it will not, the difference will not be more than 50%, the reduction in the difference of the images. But this is not an absolute test. There are some other tests which have come which say that you should look for the other causes also, the other associated symptoms also. So this test is not infallible, but it works very well at bedside. But you should not focus on just one test only to say whether this is fourth nerve palsy or a central lesion. So this was a series looking at the fourth nerve palsy etiologies, where you see that the 60% of patients had a vascular etiology, but we do not see such often involvement of the fourth nerve in the vascular etiology. But one thing I want to impress upon here is that the decompensated cases occur for about 5% of the cases. Like as you told you in the earlier case, sometimes the patient has a superior oblique weakness, but and the patient has a stress, even just stress like a fever or an infection or any other stress in acute illness, the patient may have a manifest diplopia. 5-year-old female who had one history of typical migrainous headache, and just before she came to us, the headache worsened and she had a diplopia. So as we all know, in young female, a migrainous headache, so you always think of ophthalmoplegic migraine. So this is, although this is not recognized by ICSD yet, but we see the cases of migraine with ophthalmoplegia. But the ICSD has changed this terminology to the recurrent painful ophthalmoplegic neuropathy, whereby they have given some criteria, and in MRI you see the enhancement of the nerve. But what I want to stress, coming back to, so this is one more thing in case of the migraine patient. This I came across, that sometimes the triptans may be a contributing factor towards causing an ischemic third nerve palsy. So coming back to this case, although we thought initially that this is a case of ophthalmoplegic migraine, but when we did the imaging, she had a very large basilar aneurysm, and for 1 year she just had a typical migrainous headache, and she developed this diplopia about just 15 days back. So 6 nerve palsy, as the earlier speaker said, that the importance of examining the fundus. So because we know that it's a false localizing sign in case of a raised ICP, so you should always check for the fundus, and once you follow up the patients, even if you're not doing the images and you think this is an ischemic 6 nerve palsy, it should resolve in a period of maximum up to a period of 12 weeks. You should always be cautious if the patient is not improving. So these are the causes of the, as we see, the 6 nerve palsy, the ischemic and the miscellaneous and the undetermined make a big group. And just one slide about the supranuclear things. And so in the last case, so the supranuclear, as was told by the previous, we just see the, this is basically a bilateral INO. Once the patient is asked to look towards the right, there is no adduction on the left, and the abducting eye is having nystagmus. And similarly, once the patient is looking towards the left, the right eye is not adducting. So this is a bilateral INO. INO, as is a gaze palsy, sometimes, I mean, it usually does not manifest with the diplopia, but if the diplopia is occurring, it is usually, if the adduction is limited severely, the patient has a skew, that is vertical displacement because of central cord. Sometimes they have oscillopsia and a deficient vestibulo-ocular reflex. So if a diplopia patient comes to you, you should see whether it is a monoocular or binocular. In binocular, whether it is transient or constant. In monoocular, we have seen that it can be ocular or central. If it is constant, whether it is restrictive, as in case of thyroid ophthalmopathy or orbital disease, or if it is paretic, whether it is supra or intranuclear. Supranuclear will be skew, and intranuclear will be because of the nerve involvement. And if it is not intranuclear and there is a transient diplopia, you think of myasthenia. If all this leads to nothing, so you should look for other causes of the diplopia. So with this, I thank the organizers again, and I end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kaul. We are already running short of time. So probably if there is any question or comment, it's all right. Otherwise, I hand over to Dr. Jyoti to chair the rest 2 sessions. Dr. Jyoti. Anyway.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, I'm there.
Yeah,
Yes,
you took over.
Sir, good morning, everyone. I welcome you all for the inaugural session of the day. The third session is by Dr. Vinod Puri. He is an astute clinician and a great teacher. Nerve muscle disorders are very close to his heart, so he'll be taking up the topic of hypercemia.
Good morning, everybody. Jyoti, thank you. Thank the organizer for giving the opportunity to speak on this topic, is hypercemia. Okay, you know, the energy is a very important component, and all the cells, they consume energy. However, the muscles, heart, and the brain, they consume the maximum amount of energy. What are the steps which are involved in this one? This is one, creatinine is a very important component, and it's converted to creatinine, and the main enzyme which is involved is the creatine kinase. Now this is a reversible reaction. Main store of energy is the phosphocreatinine, and the reversible reaction here ATP is produced, ATP is used, and ADP is produced. What the other reversible reactions are there? creatine kinase is basically responsible for the energy reaction, and this is basically responsible by these bioreactions. Yeah. As the creatine kinase is concerned, since I told you it occurs in the muscle and the brain, and they have different types of there. M type is the one which is primarily concerned with the muscle, and B type is the one primarily concerned with the brain. We have one more type, MB is there, which is both components of one muscle and brain is there, and that is in the cardiac muscle musculature is there. In addition to that, mitochondria, which is the main source of energy, that also contains lots of creatine kinase. And these are two varieties are there. One universally available, the ubiquitous is there. One sarcolemma, two other varieties are there. If you look at the muscle, creatine MM is in 98. The predominant involvement is the MM is there, 98%. Heart muscle, there's 30% MB is there, 70% is the muscle, MM is there. While the brain as a VB is a component is there. When you see the creatine kinase, 93% is the MM variety, and about less than 6% is the MB variety here, and negligible to about 1% is the BB is there. Mitochondria is not seen in the normal CK levels. Myocardial infarction, the CK MP level goes up more than about 6%, more than 6%. Yeah. So that's important. Before we got troponin, this was primarily used for the detection of myocardial infarction screening tools. Yeah. We have different units involved. And the CK concern with the units per liter, this is the amount of 1 micromole conversion to phosphocreatinine to produce ATP per minute that the unit is used. And by MB is nanogram per ml unit used. Normal CK that varies from lab to lab, country to country, and accuracy also is important. Sex is also important as the normal CK variation is concerned. In Europe, you got different values are there. While India, the values which are there is less than 171 units per liter, that's for the male, while the female is less than 1.4, is 145 units there. This level I told you that varies with the both sex and race. In men it's more, blacks they have more level, Asian they have more level as to Caucasian, and with the age it decreases and called sarcopenia responsible there. As I told that this is one which is used previously by marker of cardiological myocardial infarction, yeah? And however, this can also be increased when the regeneration of the fiber occurs, then after CK-MB level can go up. And chronic muscle disorder can also have, at least the one, they can also have increased the MB level. While BB1 that goes more in the brain tumor, stroke, and you can go to anticipate because concentrate in the brain itself. Now, what is hyperlipidemia is here? Persistent CK level more than 2 standard deviation of the mean for a given population, and on at least 2 separate occasions that is there. And however, the European guidelines did say the level more than 1.5 times of the upper limit of normal, and taking both gender and ethnicity into consideration. Other two more definitions are the asymptomatic hyperlipidemia and polysymptomatic hyperlipidemia. Asymptomatic is the one where you don't find any cause, there is no symptom is there, only process hyperlipidemia is the only factor is there. The poly is where you have some other features are there, which is non-specific feature like myalgia, cramps, fatigue, and physical activity is responsible. Our main component is hyperlipidemia. This will basically define the role, and who defined it as elevation of serum CK despite normal neurologic examination and investigative study, including EMG, muscle biopsy, and other things are there. Incidence goes 0.7% in large from normal population, and it may be familial. Diagnosis is based by exclusion to other causes, and then you see idiopathic hyperlipidemia. When we see the muscle, the main thing which when start coming is other things also responsible. Yes, exercise, when excessive exercise, CK level goes more. The trauma, trauma to the muscle, that also CK level goes up, and toxins are important. Medication, particularly statins, are the most important causes for the elevation of the CPK. And of course, the other causes, endocrine causes, electrolyte disturbance, renal failure, violence, these other causes are there. obstructive sleep apnea is an important entity which we have elevation of CPK levels there. One entity was a macro-CK. This is important entity. I again come back to this entity after some duration. And malignant hyperthermic syndrome is a quarter component which manifests with the elevation of CPK level. Among the medications, most important cause for CPK is the statin uses here. About 5 to 9% of the people on statin, they may have the presence of the elevation of CPK. This is an important entity. However, the people who are genetic preponderance, they are the most responsible for statin. All people do not have the statin use, hyperlipidemia, other drugs like fibrates, opoxetine, and psychotic drugs. They are particular drugs, all the drugs responsible drugs, the NMS, they can have elevation. Antiviral drugs and beta blockers, which are commonly used, but phenadrolol, cartinol, they are the elevations of CPK. Almost all the beta blockers can have elevated CPK. Over phenadrolol, these drugs are most commonly associated. Muscle disorder, there are two types: muscle disorder and non-muscle disorder, which may have low motor involvement with the other can have to have, particularly in cases of motor disease, fine muscular atrophy, post-polio syndrome, and motor neuropathies, radiculopathies, flexopathies. They can have mild elevation of CPK, and that's going to persist as long as these processes the genetic myopathy, which mentions only isolated hyperlipidemia, is a different entity. Calvinopathy, adult glycosinosis disorder type 2, and calcinopathy, dystrophinopathy, and sarcoglycanopathy, mitral dystrophy type 2 is an entity which can have elevation of CPK. That will only manifestation when you examine the person, then you find other things responsible there. Among the muscle disorders, as you know, there are the metabolic disorders, the genital disorder, inflammatory myopathy. They can all have elevation of CPK. Now, look at the causes which are there. It's not only the skeletal muscle disorder. In the cardiovascular disorders like arrhythmia, myocarditis, they can also have. As told, monoretic multiplex factors they can have. Among the inherited causes, which are the muscular dystrophy, myotonic dystrophy, metabolic and congenital myopathy may not have the elevation of CPK. It will mild elevation can be there. One important entity that is familial and sporadic. However, when you see that these people risk genetic investigation, some of the people they turn out to be Limb-Girdle syndrome or Calvin-Olin dystrophy can be responsible. They have to be taken into consideration. So when you find person, you don't find a cause, in those genetic studies are required to rule out the possibility of this possibility. Yeah. When you get the level, there are three types. You divide the patient into three groups: normal levels between 5 and 10%, and more than 20%. Different causes are there. When the muscle injuries there, or Duchenne muscular dystrophy, Becker dystrophy, they have elevation level with marked elevations there. The dermatomyositis, immune-mediated myositis, and inherited acquired rhabdomyolysis, they can have very marked elevation. However, very variety of other disorders, they can have mild 10%. If it's less than 5% is there, then you think facioscapular dystrophy, Limb-Girdle syndrome, metabolic myopathy. It's not always. Some people may have normal CPK, in spite of that person may have a myopathy or dystrophy pattern may be there. Regarding macro-CK, this is not seen routinely. The only levels are the total levels elevated, and here the electrophoresis is important, and that detects the CK. These two types are there, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is basically anti-antibody complexes, and this is 0.4 to 1.2%, and seen primarily in the autoimmune disorders. While the type 2, which is got oligomic mitochondrial CK, the prevalence is again 0.5 to 3.7%, is much more common as compared to the type 1, and seen in the malignancy of hepatic diseases. And they all have CPK levels, they will mark it elevated. Now, what is prevalence? They reported that 0.7%, this is from the northern population, and prevalence in hyperlipidemia was 1.3% of population, while idiopathic one, when they investigated all the causes, they found it was 0.7% here. And if you gain 90%, about 70% of the people, they have incidental detection hyperlipidemia, which later normalize of some duration. And the persistent hyperlipidemia in these people, 46% people, they have persistent hyperlipidemia. This is a very important study, and they reported and they analyzed the 1,285 people, and when they followed up again after 7 days or so, they again normal. After 3 days, it came down to normal, and however, it can persist with some duration there. Now, what was the cause in the people? They found the statin use was the most important cause, followed by thyroxine use is that important. They have other problems were there, but these were two important components as well as the idiopathic hyperlipidemia in this population. Yeah. Now, when you find a person, how are you going to investigate there? Investigation is individualized. Electrophysiology, clinical profile important. Imaging study, special laboratory study, muscle biopsy, genetic tests these are required in these people. What are people who, when you want to further work up people, you decide first clinically whether this is going to be asymptomatic or going to facial weakness. Of course, clinical profile is important. And you second question arises, what is my likelihood I'm going to get special diagnosis, and how shall I go for invasive monitoring, I will do biopsy, or what are possible, when I can find that the treatable cause in these disorders. Regarding EMG, you know, primary rule of the possible motor neuron disease, motor neuropathy, reticulopathy, neural junctions, which can have elevation, and they need to be further investigated and to be further determined there. Then it also helps you in finding is in myotonia there, and it determines that it's in myopathy change. This is important. If no myopathy does not mean that the person not have myopathy. And this is the basic rule of EMG in such situations there. Whether should we use the screening tool? If you analyze, you find 51 to 93% patients who later on had a biopsy, which was abnormal biopsy, they had abnormality in the EMG, and primarily it was the myopathic pattern was seen. EMG, the Prele et al. They reported that about 25% people they had normal EMG, and who were later on they had normal biopsy, and sensitivity EMG reported was 68%, while specificity is for 53%. Yeah. Now, what are people where you find more probability of having a problem? The person who has weakness along with the EMG, their possibility has the EMG has a problem, probability of myopathy is more, and the specificity is also more than person associated feature like the weakness is there. People who did not have weakness, the probability and specificity is low. Second important component is muscle biopsy there. When you find muscle biopsy, all standards are technically used. You must investigate the person for the immunohistochemistry and the other studies to be done. These are basic things to use. The study from the study from European Federation, they found that they divide certain criteria for doing the biopsy in asymptomatic people there. Asymptomatic or positive symptomatic, these are criteria defined. If the serum CK level is more than three times as normal, or EMG is myopathy, or person having age less than 25 years of age, or person having extra induced pain or fatigue, these are people who should go for biopsy there. But what were people who less than three times of a normal, and those situations in women, particularly DNA testing must be done because for the dystrophic mutation here. In men, the biopsy for the neuromuscular disorder, then biopsy is a strong suspicion, then it should be done. Definitely probable diagnosis of the biopsy is 40 up to 8 to 60% with large variations here. Normal biopsy 48 to 55%, and non-specific changes is very important, reporting up to about 60 to 83%. And this is important entity. What yield? This last study, which was Shebani, she reported that inflammatory myopathy is seen about one-fourth of the people by diagnostic biopsy associated group. And where you find some features of there, then these are the people who have special diagnosis more than 50% people. The role of muscle biopsy, various studies which can be done. There's 40 about 23 people, 23 or about one-fourth of people they have muscle biopsy there. Muscle biopsies that show some results there. Non-specific myopathy changes are very important. 42% of people, what is significance of this? We do not know right moment. It's yet to be discovered myopathy. whether more rigorous genetic study about it, because now with advanced genetic study, they can help us with the differential. Or second, again, depends on skill of interpreting physicians. Now, there are multiple biopsy studies which have been done, and they reported that 134 people, they're normal. So, primarily come to 1/4 of people, they have some features are there. And neuropathic changes were also reported about to over 5% people. Non-specific changes more predominant. Metabolic myopathy for 42%. Subclinical dystrophy about 1/5 of people, they may have these features there. Now, they reported that if you look at all the people with hypercytokemia, asymptomatic hypercytokemia, you find that about 57% they are asymptomatic and 43% they come positive symptomatic group there, and mean level also pretty high. Abnormal EMG is reported about 57%, and biopsy again 44%. Diagnosis discovered about 18% there, and likelihood of making diagnosis greater in subjects who are more than 24 years and a high CPK level, with the possibility going to be more. Now, if you overall look at all the possibilities, there are 28% people, we are 8% people, they could find the diagnosis after all the evaluation. What is prognosis of people? Reported that when you follow the people, many become, they continue about many people, they become asymptomatic after, they become, level comes down to normal. In some people, if level is persist, even but at a lower level, not to treat as a normal, but goes to lower levels, yeah. And 22.1 people is normal outcome duration, and some of the odd features people may have some dystrophy, limb-girdle dystrophy, myopathy feature with there. One important entity, how many percent of people they can have abnormal malignant hyperthermia syndrome? About 1/3 of people they can have, they can do 30 about they can have malignant hyperthermia syndrome. This can be association. Now, how you evaluate the person? There's if CPK level is less than recheck CPK levels, and after reduced physical activity, you find CPK level still elevated, then you go further. If there's no elevation after exercise, then no further workup is required. If you find explained by the medical condition, CPK level, which explain medical condition, or person takes a medication like taking extra, that is responsible, then again nothing is required. If this gets clear, then don't go back. The future of the medication then become better.
So we are running short of time. Please.
Only one more slide. That's all. If CKs increase more than 1.5, then you evaluate further. Then look for other causes, motor neuron disease and other factors which is non-neurological, non-factor that are responsible. If you find CK still more than 5, then EMG and nerve conduction surgery required. You find no evidence of, if you find evidence of myopathy, then you go for specific causes here, like I told you before. If you don't find specific changes in the biopsy, then you go for genetic study, and if you don't find, then only diagnosis of asymptomatic schizophrenia is made. This is same more laboratory form. Now, somebody correctly kind of biomarker with good muscle specificity, normal values they vary with the race and sex. Several factors can elevate CK level absent underlying neuromuscular disease. Elevated levels often carry a benign prognosis. Depending on the context, you may find the biopsy that can be from 70 to 80%. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was very elaborate talk on hypercycemia by Dr. Vinod Puri. The next speaker is Dr. Animesh Das. So may I invite the next speaker to deliver a talk on a child who moves too much. Dr. Animesh Das, please.
Yes, ma'am, I'm sharing my slides. Are my slides visible?
Yes, sir. Please make full screen.
Yeah. So it's only 10 minutes left, so I'll try to complete my talk within the next 10 minutes. The topic for today, my talk is a child who moves too much. So basically, I will be dealing with the hyperkinetic disorders of childhood. So coming to the hyperkinetic disorders of childhood, there are 6 main types of disorders which we see in a childhood in a patient of hyperkinetic disorder. There is a dystonia, chorea, bellism, and athetosis are considered as a part of the chorea in the current movement disorder classification. And coming to the third part is myoclonus. The fourth one is tremor, and tics and stereotypies. Because of the shortage of time, I will not go into the details of tics and stereotypies, because these are the movement disorders. Although they are common, the tics are most common disorders, movement disorders in children. They will not present to us basically because of this small movement disorders. Tics are a variable pattern, short duration movement disorder, which have a definite premonitory urge, and they have a suppressive pattern defined tics. When the children generally don't present to us with tics unless they have associated Tourette syndrome with vocal tics, which make them socially unacceptable. So I will basically deal with the dystonia, chorea, myoclonus, and tremor. The first step in the approaching a child with movement disorders or any adult with movement disorders is first to establish the phenomenology. This is the most important step in approaching a case of movement disorder, because after we determine what phenomenology it is, whether it is dystonia, whether it is chorea, whether it is myoclonus, or whether it is tremor, then we will go to the investigative procedures, and also the causes are variable in these disorders. So the investigative procedure, the further treatment management, and the further prognosis will depend which movement disorder the child had. So first, I approach the movement disorder in the following pattern. First, I see whether it is pattern or non-pattern. If the movement disorder is showing some and a fixed pattern, then it is obviously dystonia, segmental myoclonus, tremor, or stereotypy. It can't be anything else. Now, if the patient is showing non-pattern, there is no fixed pattern of movement disorder like the chorea, bellism, athetosis, and tics, then we have to then these movement disorders are non-pattern basically. Then I come to see whether the movement disorder is rhythmic or arrhythmic. In rhythmic, in the pattern group, the tremor, segmental myoclonus, and stereotypies are rhythmic. The rest all are arrhythmic. Now we'll see what are the associated factors. In associated factors, we see whether there are any sensory tricks, whether there are any premonitions, whether there is any aggravating and relieving factor, whether there is relation to sleep and posture. Sleep and posture are important because in sleep we see the palatal myoclonus is the only movement disorder which will be there in sleep, and in posture there are specific movement disorder like orthostatic myoclonus and orthostatic tremor which present only in posture. So this relation to sleep and posture is important. Now I will go to the first movement. The definition given by in movement disorder MDS is in 2013 by Kailash Bhatia group is very important to know what are the patterns. What is the exact definition of dystonia, because each and every line is important here. The dystonia is sustained or intermittent. Dystonia can be always we generally look dystonia as a sustained posture, but it can also be intermittent according to the definition. So sustained or intermittent muscle contraction causing abnormal posture, abnormal often repetitive movement postures, or both. Dystonic movements are typically patterned, as we have already discussed, and often initiated and worsened by voluntary action and associated with overflow muscle activation. I am showing these videos. This is a patient who presented to us with generalized started in the lowering, then it gradually within the next 3 years it gradually involved the whole it became the generalized dystonia. So we the genetic confirmation, it came out as DYT1 dystonia. So it was a primary generalized dystonia in this patient. So the phenomenology of dystonia, this is all of the things are written in the this pattern, worsens with action, and presence of sensory tricks are there in the definition only. So it's important to notice these 3 tips, which are the phenomenology of the dystonia, which characterize the phenomenology of dystonia. There are 2 types of dystonia, as I have already shown. That it can be slow twisting with abnormal posture, or it can be rapid jerky. In rapid jerky, we know that blepharospasm is a rapid jerky form of hemifacial dystonia. The laryngeal dystonia, in abductor laryngeal dystonia, there can be in between there can be adduction, and so it will be rapid and jerky movement. and rapid and jerky movement of jerky voice. In dystonic tremor, it is obviously rapid and jerky when dystonia is associated with tremor, and myoclonus dystonia because of the myoclonus. Dystonia can be present in slow twisting postures with abnormal postures, or it can be rapid and jerky. Now, whenever after classifying a patient as this patient is having dystonia, now we go to the second part, which is the classify the patient in axis 1 and axis 2. In axis 1 we will have the clinical manifestation. In axis 2 we will have the etiological part. In axis 1, the age of onset, body distribution, temporal features, and associated features. The temporal features is important because in temporal features, if a patient if we see here, if a patient present in infancy, and it will give we can most likely the patient will be a case of inherited metabolic disease, or if the patient is presenting in childhood and adolescent with slowly with a progression within the next 5 years into generalized dystonia, there can be inherited, isolated, or degenerative dystonias. Now coming to the associated feature, presence of associated feature like pure dystonia. If the patient is having the pure dystonia, it will be most probably the patient has combined with other features, other neurological pattern of involvement other than tremor. So it can be a more generalized disease rather than primary dystonia itself. Now coming to the etiological part, anatomic we have to divide into anatomic pathology and inheritance. We will go to the inheritance part only. Inheritance part will determine what etiology we have. We can have acquired lesion or we can have inherited lesion. I'm not able to forward my slides. Now coming to the inherited, whenever we have classified whether the child is having inherited lesion or acquired lesion, we will if the child has secondary other feature, then it is well and good. It is obviously going to secondary dystonia. Some points of difference have been pointed out in a recent article, which shows which are the primary and secondary dystonia to the other primary to help us differentiate between primary and secondary dystonia. In primary dystonia, we will have gradual onset and slow progression, and presence of dystonic tremor. Either there is maybe some chronic inflammatory process or peripheral trauma in case of these hemifacials in peripheral trauma in region affected by dystonia. There can be use of sensory tricks in dystonia, more sensory tricks in dystonia, and spontaneous emission. In secondary dystonia, abrupt onset and rapid progression, fixed dystonic postures, more frequently at rest, hemidystonia, cranial onset dystonia in childhood, restriction to focal segmental dystonia in children, adult onset of leg dystonia, progression to generalized dystonia, prominent orovalvular involvement, and other neurological system involvement. These are the cases of inherited dystonia. We will not go into the detail. This is a long list. And inherited childhood dystonia. Now coming to the acquired childhood dystonia, there can be dystonia, dystonic cerebral palsy, hemidystonia, infantile thalamic necrosis, and infections. So we basically have to define whether it is dystonia one and axis 2, and then we, depending on the time course and the etiology, we classify whether it is primary and secondary, and then decide whether to go for the next generation panels. So see here whether it is dystonia, we define the axis 1 and axis 2, which is if there are some, we classify the patient as having specific etiology and it is a primary disease, we go for single gene testing. If there are a small number of etiology, like if the patient has ataxia along with it, so it can be ataxia telangiectasia or ataxia with oculomotor apraxia presenting in dystonia. So we do a targeted gene panel. In cases as potentially associated with multiple genes, we go for broad genetic panel or whole genome sequencing. And obviously in a case presenting in a childhood, we'll have to do the TMS, GCMS, as metabolic disorders are a part of the disorders we present in childhood. Now coming to the chorea, these are the 4 qualities of chorea which we know: the randomness, flowing quality, parakinesia, and motor impersistence. The bellism and athetosis are considered as a part of the chorea. Now the child who presented to us with chorea, you can see who had some febrile encephalopathy at 2 years of age, and then she was having this hemidystonia. She had basal ganglia involvement and the midbrain involvement, maybe some post-encephalitic. No records are available. Only the MRI was available when the child came to us. So we can see the motor impersistence here and the hemichorea. hemichoria we have seen in the upper limb. We will see in the lower limb also. The lower limb on the right side is also having this choreiform movements.
Dr. Nimesh, we are running short of time.
Yes, ma'am. So the differential diagnosis according to the distribution of the chorea, basically in the childhood chorea, we have to localize to we have to see the orobuccal region, and we will find out whether the patient is having some chorea acanthocytosis or Leschnian syndrome or some PCAN. The diagnostic approach to chorea, we will have to find out the time code, the acute and subacute or the chronic. In acute and subacute, we'll look for the structural, metabolic, autoimmune infection and drugs. Also in children, we'll have to look for the sedena. In chronic, more than 1 year, we will look for the causes of benign genetic causes of chorea which present in the childhood. I will skip this, and these are the acquired causes which are caused structural, metabolic, infectious, drug-induced, autoimmune, paraneoplastic, and others. We all know, these are the features which will determine a patient of secondary chorea and subacute chorea. Coming to the myoclonus, when we classify a case of myoclonus, when you see a case of myoclonus, we basically try to divide the myoclonus into 4 types, whether it is physiologic, whether it is essential, whether it is epileptic or symptomatic. In physiologic, it is a normal phenomena in healthy children. In essential myoclonus, it is the myoclonus is the primary symptom. There will be no developmental delay or mild developmental delay, and there will be non-progressive history. In epileptic myoclonus, the seizures will be the predominant part, and in symptomatic myoclonus, there will be other neurological associations. So we know here we basically divide the myoclonus into these 4 groups, and then we approach. Basically on the history and clinical examination, we divide the myoclonus into physiological, essential, epileptic, and symptomatic. We try to do the pattern recognition, whether it falls into any pattern, and we see by routine ancillary testing whether it is whether metabolic, infectious, parainfectious causes are there. If it is not there, then we go for comprehensive testing or whole exome sequencing. Now coming to the tremor, we basically, when we approach a case of tremor, we basically divide the case into action tremor and we basically divide the case into action tremor and resting tremor. Action tremor is basically will have these predominant causes in childhood, and the resting tremor have only 2 tremors: the drug-induced resting tremor and Parkinsonism. There were no other causes of resting tremors to the best of my knowledge. So how to proceed to final diagnosis? When we see a movement disorder, we classify the predominant movement disorder. When we see a movement disorder, we try to classify the predominant movement disorder. We try to look for other neurological features, and we'll try to look for other non-neurological features. Like in cases of ataxia telangiectasia, we can see telangiectasia. In cases of Friedreich's ataxia, we can see other causes, other features of Friedreich's ataxia. And then we divide and try to identify the case into clinically based syndrome. If it is a clinically based, where we do that specific testing, and we cleanse the diagnosis. If we don't have if we diagnose a clinically based syndrome and we are not able to find out the cause by primary investigation, then we go for the diagnostic workup, final diagnostic workup, which will be obviously the whole genome sequencing or the next generation sequencing. I will try to finish my talk.
Thank you, Dr. Nimesh. That was very practical approach to hyperkinetic movement disorder of childhood. With
Thank
this,
you,
because of the want of the time, we won't be able to take up any questions. With this, I conclude the first session of day 3 of DNACon 2021. And I hand over the mic to organizers.